Good evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you are joining us for this conversation around the book, The Concept of Human Rights in Africa, published by CODESRIA through the pen of Professor Issa Shivji, Emeritus Professor, University of Dar es Salaam. I'm hoping that you all can hear me and that it's time to really begin. My name is Godwin Murunga. I'm the Executive Secretary of CODESRIA, and I'm happy to welcome you all to this particular session. I wish that CODESRIA could take credit for the convening of this event, but actually this has been largely through the initiative of the Bicontinental, especially with the effort of Efemia Chela, who is going to speak to us later after me. The book, The Concept of Human Rights in Africa, is a very, very cherished book of CODESRIA. We, through a conversation that I had with the Professor Issa Shivji sometime in the third quarter of last year, we decided to reissue the book with a new introduction and a new foreword. And we were happy to be able to do it in record time. We actually did have an initial launch of the book at the University of Dar es Salaam sometime in November last year. But I think that the opportunity provided by new technology will enable us even have a better reach with this discussion this evening. So I just want, first of all, to thank Efemia for making sure that this happened. And I want to thank Professor Issa Shivji for his enthusiastic response when the idea was shared with him, and to basically invite all of us into a conversation that I believe is going to illuminate the topic of human rights in a way perhaps that has not received the kind of attention that it's not supposed to receive. Before I invite Efemia to intervene and Professor Issa Shivji, I just want to make a couple of remarks. Mainly remarks that actually put context to two things. One, the engagement that CODESRIA has had with Professor Issa Shivji, and two, the engagement that led to the publication of this particular book. I was unable to count how many publications CODESRIA has done with Professor Issa Shivji. And part of the reason for that is that the history of CODESRIA and that of Professor Issa Shivji are intertwined in numerous significant ways that have left a mark, not just in the field of social sciences, but on radical scholarship in general. And that in the history of that engagement, Professor Issa Shivji has come through in a way that is not just radical, but consistently radical. And so it is a story that at some point we'll have to retell in a different forum. The book, The Concept of Human Rights in Africa, can be thought of as a book that does a rescue mission of the notion of human rights, which, as Issa Shivji himself puts it, has been used as part of the weapons deployed by imperialism to justify what Vijay Prasad calls international division of humanity. It is a rescue mission that falls in line with several other publications that we know of that have engaged in rescuing the social sciences from a very imperialist orientation. The one that actually came to mind is from another comrade of Issa Shivji, whom I personally never had a chance to meet, but who is a former president of CODESRIA, the late Professor Claude Ake. His book, Social Science as Imperialism, speaks very directly to the rescue mission that I believe Issa Shivji has tried to make in his intervention with the book, The Concept of Human Rights in Africa. It's a rescue mission that essentially accepts the fact that the notion of human rights is central to many of the struggles that we deploy in society. But it's also one that acknowledges that the manner in which the notion of human rights has been accepted does not play a transformatory role in society, and that occasionally it is deployed in order to essentially keep us quiet, in order to simply smear over some of the struggles that people have engaged in over time. It's a book that actually speaks to the contemporary realities of society. And I thought that it would be useful for us to have that engagement that we want to have in the context of the current struggles that are happening across the world, in which the notion of human rights is seen as applicable in only particular contexts and ignored and disregarded in other contexts. It's not by surprise for me that it is the South Africa that is playing a central role in reminding all of us of the centrality of human rights across the board, with its arguments at the International Court of Justice, for instance, but also with the sustained engagement that South Africa has had on the issue of the occupation, but also the current genocide that is obviously happening before our own eyes in Gaza and extending beyond Gaza into other territories in Palestine. This book speaks not just to the current concerns that are happening in that region of the world, but in many other parts of the world, and is bringing what one would call a global Africa conversation on human rights to the rest of the world. And I want, therefore, to invite all of us to not just celebrate the book, but to engage it deeply, precisely because that is what Issa Shivji would want. He often tells me, and he did tell me this many times when I was editing a collection of essays that he published through Fahamu, that is titled, Where is Uhuru? That ideas flourish in a situation of contestation, and urged us to think about some of the deep issues that affect society. We are happy that Issa Shivji has given us numerous instances to engage with these ideas, and that this is just but one of those moments that we're going to do this. So without wasting more time, without adding anything that isn't new to the discussion, I want to begin by, I don't know how we want to go at this. Maybe Professor Issa Shivji will speak a little bit to the book, and then we'll ask Efemia to engage some of the ideas that she finds relevant to the discussion, and then we'll open up for a further engagement from colleagues who are listening to us from wherever you are. With that said, can I welcome Professor Issa Shivji to make an initial reflection on this?
Well, thank you very much, Godwin. Thank you, Efemia, and thank you, Tricontinental CODESRIA and Left Books for organizing this. On the occasion of the 35th anniversary of the concept of human rights in Africa. As you know, this book was published in 1989. I finished writing it in 1988 in Harare, where I was spending my first sabbatical. I refused to go to any university in the north. I decided to go to Harare for my sabbatical. And that's why I finished this book. Now, what I want to do briefly, and I really hope to be brief, is to situate the writing of this book in the context, the background and also the immediate motivation which made me write this book. And for that, I will sort of, in a kind of telegraphic messages form, paint the context in broad strokes. 1980s in Africa is considered by many mainstream writers as a lost decade for Africa. For me, 1980s was actually a decade of painful transition from nationalism to neoliberalism, during which Africa lost many of its achievements of the national liberation struggle, including sovereignty, self-determination, and the right to determine our own destiny and to make our own decisions. During the nationalist period, which is roughly the 2 decades of 60s and 70s, as you know, many African countries became independent in the 1960s. The dominant ideology was nationalism, of whatever variant. It is the ideology of nationalism which captured the national liberation movement, which preceded getting of independence. I would say that within nationalism, there are two broad tendencies. One I call conservative state nationalism, and the other was some kind of left radical nationalism. Now, the basic premise of state nationalism was that after independence, it was time to consolidate independence, which in class terms really meant to consolidate the rule of the proto-bourgeoisies and the petty bourgeoisies, which had come to power after independence. On the other hand, radical nationalism argued that independence was only the first step, that the task of national liberation was unfinished, was incomplete with independence. That what was needed was that political independence must be followed by economic independence, because the threat of colonialism coming back to the back door was very much there. And this is what was famously called neocolonialism. I don't know if many of the young people remember the 1965 publication of Kwame Nkrumah, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And in fact, some nationalist leaders, particularly radical nationalist leaders, even argued that we should beware that for the second scramble for Africa. Unfortunately, they have been proved right. The second scramble did come to pass, and today we are very much in throes of that. More left tendency within nationalism went further and argued that what we needed was some kind of disengagement, delinking, as it was called at that time, from imperialism, from the international capitalist system. So that was the discourse, that was the debate of the nationalist period. Although there were these different tendencies, all tendencies broadly agreed that the countries which were still under colonial rule, like South Africa and Southern Africa, ought to be decolonized, number one, and number two, that African countries should unite to be able to withstand the onslaught of imperialism. I think by and large, Africa succeeded in decolonizing the rest of the African continent, but they did not quite succeed in African unity. Even then, through coerced compromise, they formed the Organization of African Unity, which was really actually a compromise. I will not go over the debate on African unity. On the whole, in spite of all these various tendencies and discourses, generally speaking, during this period, imperialism was on the defensive. the third world countries were very prominent and dominant in, for example, United Nations and whether United Nations fora. It is during this period that, for example, the right to development, the resolution on the right to development was adopted by the United Nations. It is during this period that we had the body called UNCTAD, which did some fantastic research on unequal terms of trade and other things. It is during this period that African scholars wrote on the drainage of surplus from the continent to the metropolis. Towards the end of the 70s and early 80s, African countries entered into very deep economic crisis for various reasons, which I cannot go into. But among these was that none of the African countries was able to successfully transform its agriculture sector. On another occasion, probably I will argue more about that. There were some gains made in import substitution industrialization. Also, there were some gains in the social sector, like education, health, water, and so on. But the biggest reason for the crisis was the mounting debts and inability of the African countries to be able to service these debts, which rendered them subject to diktats by the donors and the so-called world financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. In the early 1980s, as you may know, African countries, as I said, as I already said, entered the deep economic crisis. But during the same period, the neo-conservative forces in the north came to power and began to flex their muscles. And during this period, we get the infamous duo of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US, who fervently pushed neoliberal policies based on Milton Friedman's free market and liberalized economy. That became the new mantra, and which was pushed down the throats of many third world countries, and which is what brought in neoliberalism in our country. Neoliberalism meant a whole new set of policies which were imposed on many African countries through conditionalities. For conditionalities coming with the loans and so on. We had structural adjustment programs, as you'll remember, some of you may remember. We had liberalization of trade, opening up of markets. We had wholesale privatization of national assets. We had cost sharing in the social sector, in education, health, and so on. And actually, by and large, these policies devastated African economies and destroyed the social fabric of society, of our societies. On the whole, during this period, imperialism was on the offensive. There was a clear attack on sovereignty, particularly on state sovereignty. The state was demonized as being corrupt, inefficient, with bloated bureaucracies, not able to make policies, and so on and so forth. And that African states were essentially authoritarian and non-democratic and violators of human rights. It was this type of argument that made the so-called donors to channel their funding through NGOs, new non-governmental organizations, because African states were corrupt. And ideologically, it was the human ideology which displaced national liberation ideologies. During this period, NGOs mushroomed all over Africa and were almost uncritically embraced by the civil society. Unlike, for example, Latin America and Asia, where there was more critical position taken on NGOs, in Africa, NGOs sailed plainly, and universities, which were once upon a time the centers of thinking, were starved of resources, and many of our intellectuals and scholars jumped on the human rights bandwagon and the NGO bandwagon. It is in this context, very briefly, it was in this context that I came to write the book towards the end of the decade of the 1980s. Now, what does the book try to do? First and foremost, it argues that human rights is an ideology, that human rights is a historical and political construct. It is not some God-given, natural, universal set of norms which universally apply across space and across time. The second point I made was that the individual is abstracted from her social relations and then attributed with certain rights which are attributed to the individual. So individual being has these rights. Social being is converted into individual being, an abstract individual being, which then becomes the carrier of these rights. So the whole notion, philosophically, the philosophical foundations were essentially rooted in the bourgeois ideology of individualism, which was very strong. The whole question of atomization of individuals. You will remember that during this period, Margaret Thatcher is said to have made her most infamous remark, which is society. What society? There's no such thing as society. They're only individuals, which sums up the individualization of the neoliberal ideology. I secondly argued that human rights ideology politically is deployed by imperialism as a new form of domination of African people and states, a kind of ideology being used as a whip to beat African states with. And I showed it through argumentation of how this human rights ideology was deployed. So in short, the argument of the book was that we needed to turn the human rights ideology on its head, that we needed to reconfigure human rights ideology to make it an ideology of resistance to hegemony, resistance to the dominant human rights discourse. So I proposed a resistant human rights discourse. And here I argue that there are two most important rights around which we can construct, or rather reconstruct, the human rights ideology as an ideology of resistance. And I identified these two rights as a right of peoples to self-determination and a right of peoples to organize independently. And right of people's self-determination, I gave it a wider meaning of not only political self-determination, but also economic self-determination. And the right of people to organize mean that people should be free to organize for their own resistance to domination, essentially against compradorial classes. So basically, these two rights would sum up, in my view, the important flanks of anti-imperialism and anti-compradorialism, anti-imperialism and anti-authoritarianism. So the two rights were supposed to mobilize the people both against imperialism, but also against reactionary domestic classes. And to illustrate these two perspectives on rights, the dominant and the resistant perspective, I gave the example of the African Charter on Individual People's Rights as as signifying a kind of neoliberal construct of human rights, and the Algiers Declaration, the declaration which was called Universal Declaration of Rights of Peoples, as a symbolic of the national liberation human rights ideology, an ideology of resistance. So that was very briefly what I tried to do in the book. Since then, of course, we are 35 years have passed, and we have seen a lots of things, and we have witnessed in extreme forms the brutality of imperialism, which has destroyed whole countries like Somalia, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. And now, in front of our own eyes, we're witnessing the genocide which is happening in Gaza against the Palestinian people. So in my new introduction to the second edition, I argue for a case to go beyond human rights ideology. I'm no longer talking about reforming or reconfiguring human rights ideology. I'm actually arguing that we need to have a revolutionary shift in the paradigm. We need to have a revolutionary shift in the paradigm beyond human rights. I'm arguing for a new reimagining of Pan-Africanism. I'm arguing for an imagery beyond nation states, beyond state sovereignty, beyond stateship, and beyond rights, to an imagery rooted in the Pan-African solidarities and Pan-African ethos and Pan-African human values of global Africa. So, what I'm arguing, and let me finish there, is for a new outlook. I'm arguing we need a new utopia which would save humanity from mutilation it has suffered over the last 5 centuries of imperialist capitalist barbarism. And I'm arguing that Pan-African ideology and movement provides us with a great departure point for imagining a new future. Thank you very much. Thank you, Efemia, for tolerating my few remarks. I hope they were few enough and not long.
I think, thank you very much, Prof, for the succinct summary you provided. I think we should just proceed directly to Efemia for your intervention.
Thank you, Godwin. I formed my intervention after reading this amazing book in a series of questions that I'd like to pose to you, Issa, to kind of hone in on some of the different aspects of human rights that you explore in the book. I love the book. It raises some really important legal, philosophical, and revolutionary questions, and it's written in a very lively and accessible style, which I think would be a great addition to many bookshelves, especially during the time of uncertainty, which we find us in on the continent and elsewhere. So I was very interested to learn about the Algiers Declaration, and you describe 2 approaches in human rights: the dominant tendency, which you're quite critical of, and the revolutionary tendency. And as you've said, while the African Charter on Human and People's Rights is very well known, it prepares the ground for the dominant human rights approach, upheld by regional bodies and international NGOs, whereas the Algiers Declaration of 1976, I think, is a little bit less familiar. And I was wondering if you could speak about who wrote the Algiers Declaration, what kind of political history it comes out of, and what kind of framework that gives us for the revolutionary human rights approach that you describe.
Good question, Efemia. I know Algiers Declaration is not really very well known, understandably so. It was adopted in 1976 by liberation movements. The participants were liberation movements and progressive individuals. And it was written as a declaration of people's rights. So throughout, it's not talking about individual rights, it's talking about people's rights. And it was consciously seen as providing an ideology for mobilization of the people against imperialism. So it was not seen as a finished product, as a declaration of norms, okay, cast in stone. No, it was seen much more as a dynamic declaration for mobilizing people for their liberation and for the emancipation. Unlike, for example, the African Charter. The African Charter, as you know, of course, was adopted by the states. So it's very much a statist document. Unlike the Algiers Declaration, which was really, I would call it a people's document. Now, all these decades later, both, in my view, both of these instruments, of course, have been overtaken by events. So we need to think afresh. We need to think afresh, because since then, African scholarship has made a contribution which is not often acknowledged, because we always turn to the scholarship from the North. African scholarship has made a contribution in the area of Pan-Africanism, in the area of social sciences, which provide us with the possible tools to reimagine the world, as I said towards the end of my introduction, Efemia. I don't know if it fully answers your question, but for that reason also, I reproduced that declaration in the book. So it is the appendix in the book.
Thank you, Issa. That really gives us a sense of where that particular document came from. Another contribution you mentioned that Africa has made is to international human rights discourse is the right to development. And however, you write, underlying the right to development is a conception that sees development or democracy as charity from above, rather than result of struggles from below. And it isn't exactly clear what the right to development actually entails, as it's become a catch-all for many competing agendas. Do you think that this right has real value outside of it just being used as a slogan that we see by NGOs and international organizations? And is there anything in it that can actually be used to achieve the economic freedom we need?
Again, the book actually discusses at length the right to development and argues that fitted in with the ideology of developmentalism, which was quite dominant in the 60s and 70s. And as you rightly point out, the agency for development was supposed to be the state, so from above. The concept of development was a narrow concept of development in terms of economic development. So I would say that maybe it had some value at the time it was adopted, particularly in relation to domination of the North. It has some value, but I no longer see it having much of a value. I certainly don't see it as some kind of a instrument which sets certain norms, because development is a very dynamic concept. And more recently, I've been arguing of development following Julius Nyerere as a rebellion. So development is not simply a question of growth in GDP or economic development, but it is actually rebellion against the status quo. That is development. So it's a very contested terrain. Development is a contested terrain. There's no single answer.
I agree. I think that's a very useful intervention. Seeing development as ongoing, also something which is directed from below for the masses, and also something which rebels against the dominant structures and the dominant norms that keep us overexploited. My final question before we open up to the audience, please put your answers, your contributions, your comments in the Q&A box. It's available for you to be part of this discussion. But my final question is really around the current conjuncture. So there've been around 9 coups, or some of them failed, some of them, I guess, successful, on the African continent since 2020. And I was wondering, in your view, what are the links between the season of coups and struggles against imperialism? Imperialism, which is a material and ideological condition which makes the achievement of human rights for all and the utopia you speak of nearly impossible.
I was saying, could you please repeat your question? I did not quite get it.
Sorry, I can definitely repeat it. I was wondering what you think the links were between struggles against imperialism and the recent coups that we've been seeing across the African continent. There have been around 9 coups since 2020. And I was wondering if you saw any links between imperialism and those coups, and also how that fits into people's struggles to try and achieve human rights for everyone.
Yeah, I think we are facing, in this struggle, we are facing 2 basic questions. One is ideological, another is organizational. And when we talk about ideology at the political level, I think we should bring in question of our world outlook, that is the theory. The problem with us in Africa, and particularly with our scholarship, has been that it has not quite managed to de-link it as an appendage of the theories produced in the North. So we're very much linked. We have become an appendage of the theories produced in the North. So far as the South is concerned, so far as Africa is concerned, there's division of labor. We provide the data. We provide the raw material, so to speak. While the raw material is processed in the North and comes back to us as theories, which we then adopt. Rather than we ourselves producing theories from our own real conditions and applying it to our own real conditions to see the way forward. In other words, what I'm arguing for essentially is what Amilcar Cabral said, theory, the weapon of theory. We have not quite managed, by and large, to turn a theory into weapon. And we can only turn theory into weapon if we produce it ourselves. We cannot use master's theory to be a weapon against the master. So based on that, then of course, we can think in terms of ideologies which will mobilize people, which will be deployed to bring people together. The second question, as I said, is organization. We have gone through a whole host of organizations, from political parties to movements, to NGOs, and so on and so forth. And by and large, we have not managed quite to come to an organizational form which will bring together the people, because organization is an important vehicle for people to fight, to resist, to overturn, and to imagine the future. You don't imagine the future as individuals. You imagine the future in a collective through an organization. On the other side, there are some good signs that different Pan-African groups are rising among young people. More recently, I've come across Pan-African groups from South Africa, from North Africa, from West Africa, and people, young people, are on their own organizing new groups. And that is why I increasingly been arguing that our point of departure is to reimagine Pan-Africanism in a present conditions, because that points both to a possible theory, a possible movement, and a possible organization. Thank you, Efemia.
Thanks, Issa. We have a question that's come through from the audience. I'd like to read it out. It comes to us from Melissa Hendrickser. Thanks so much for coming, Melissa. She writes, I've not had a chance yet to read Professor Shivji's book, but she greatly looks forward to it. She says, recalling Mikhail Mutua's strong critique of international NGOs, she's interested, Professor Shivji, in hearing your thoughts on the recent trend amongst INGOs to decolonize international human rights and international justice. She asks, do you think decolonization is possible, particularly as led by INGOs? And maybe you could speak a bit about how the project of decolonizing human rights relates to your proposal of revolutionizing human rights.
Thank you. I know the decolonial discourse is very much in the fashion. I am not quite a fan of decolonial discourse. Maybe I am too orthodox. I don't think it adds to understanding. I still think what we need to think is in terms of liberation and emancipation rather than decolonization. And particularly if this is led by international NGOs, or, as I said in the book, all kinds of other NGOs like FUNGOs, foreign-funded NGOs, CONGOs, government-organized NGOs, and so on and so forth, I think it leads us astray. So, in short, my answer would be that we need to look at more critically at the decolonization theories and ask ourselves whether it provides us a possible point of departure for revolutionizing the human rights discourse. Although, as I said in my original presentation, I think we need to transcend and go beyond the human rights discourse. Yeah.
Thanks, Issa, for helping us think through the current discourse. I agree with you, and I do think, Melissa, that your skepticism is right, because a lot of these international NGOs are using the branding of decolonization in their literature, in their marketing. But when you look at the funding dynamics, when you look at who holds the power, and you look at the way that they operate, it seems like more of a surface level initiative than a deeper engagement with those kind of ideas. We're taking another question from the audience. We've got a lovely intervention here by Margot Bunster. Thank you so much for coming, Margot. She says, generally when African countries were emancipated, governing systems were not broken down to start from the ground up, but the new government systems simply extended their governing with the imperialist systems. So she asks two related questions. Was this a problem that encouraged dependency on the imperialists? And then she adds, do you think that corruption was built into aid and loans provided by international organizations, but we do not see those organizations or label them as corrupt?
It's a good question. I think our independence movement inherited the state. And whatever policies were adopted were essentially adopted with the state as the agency. And therefore, invariably, we did not quite manage to dismantle the state. Even where the possibility arose, like for example in Mozambique, where there was a conjuncture, there was a possibility, there was a moment where a new state could be built, because old state had been more or less destroyed. We built the new state in the image of the old state, of the colonial state. So that has been a real issue. Secondly, I agree with the question that by and large, aid actually has been a weapon. Aid is not aid. We very well know that. Aid is a trap, okay, to keep us within the system, because it reproduces itself. There is no end game to aid. It reproduces itself. You continuously take aid. And of course, it has a fantastic corrupting influence. And aid basically facilitates foreign multinational investment and rep of our resources. That's what aid does. In fact, in the 60s, there was a book by, I forget now the name of the, I think it was Teresa Hayter, called Aid as Imperialism. A small penguin book, which really argued the case against aid, and aid as imperialism. So, two things. Aid is a corrupting influence. Two, aid obviously reinforces dependency. And three, aid continues to reproduce imperialist domination and exploitation of the resources of the continent. And all this cannot be taken care of unless we succeed in building movements from the bottom, building movements based on the struggles of the people themselves. Yeah.
I think that's a very accurate assessment. It definitely is something that needs to be broad-based. And I think someone in the comments has asked, Michael, thank you for contributing. Michael Aziz asks, what are some of the Pan-African groups that you have identified or have worked with that give you hope for human rights and that give you hope for movement building across the African continent? I think it would be really good to hear from you some of the groups you think are going in the right direction.
Well, I think for South African, Pan-African, Efemia can give some of the examples because she's very much involved in it. Nearer home here, for example, in Kenya, they have a very interesting movement among young people called social justice centers. And in the Cameroon, in West Africa, also there's some movements. I cannot often give their names and addresses, but those are there. And what is interesting is that these movements on their own initiative are coming together. So I think, and that is very positive, because we are no longer feel bound by the boundaries which were left by the colonial states. And that's a very important point for Pan-Africanism. To transcend and not to be trapped by the boundaries left to us by colonialism. You must find all ways of disrupting those boundaries, so to speak. So
Thank you.
Said, yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, go on, Efemia.
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay, go
on. I guess in terms of the groups that I sort of work with, my scholarly work deals with feminism and rights for LGBT people in Africa. And it's quite interesting because a lot of the backlash against groups who are LGBT in Africa comes from the idea that it would be un-African to give those groups rights. It also draws on the African Charter's insistence on the duty to the institution of the family, which means a particular kind of family, a straight family, a heterosexual family. And so it's been interesting to see in the work that I do, working with organizations such as Holla Africa, which are a Pan-African feminist hub who provide education and support for lesbian women across the continent, how they are forming a kind of Pan-Africanism that rejects patriarchy, that rejects sexism, and wants freedom in many expansive ways, I think that often a lot of Africans don't think that they deserve. So a lot of what happens with LGBT organizations is they're presented as only advocating for rights for LGBT people. But at the same time, if LGBT groups can't organize, that means that the country actually has a problem with freedom of association. And so many other groups who are contesting autocracy, people who are fighting for police brutality, people who are opposition parties, also struggle to have the right and the freedom to associate. So these kind of organizations give me hope when it comes to creating the utopia we want, and as well as human rights for all kinds of groups. All right, we are nearing the end of our session. I'm going to take one final question from the audience. Issa, we have a contribution here from Vera. Thanks so much for coming, Vera. She was wondering, could you comment in more detail on a section of the African Charter for Human and People's Rights? This section comes from the preamble. The section says that it undertakes to eliminate colonialism, neocolonialism, apartheid, and Zionism. Now, of course, these are issues we still struggle with continent-wide, but they are part of the African Union's preamble. So how do you think that idiosyncrasy, how do you think that paradox comes about?
That's very interesting. Most people have forgotten that, that Zionism was included in the preamble. But until very recently, it was forgotten, right? To the extent that Israel was even being admitted to become an observer, a Zionist state, to become an observer at AU, until South Africa took a very strong stand against it. And it was only its last session, 37th session at the AU summit, that for the first time the African Union came out against what is happening in Gaza and against Zionism. But people forgot that the charter which was passed in the 80s clearly mentioned Zionism. Because Zionism is, in my view, an extension of imperialism. It is apartheid, it is racism to the core. That's what Zionist ideology is all about. And no Pan-African came to be a Pan-Africanist if that Pan-Africanist is not against Zionism as well, does not share in the struggle of the Palestinian people. So I think that your pointing this out is extremely important. And I think we should highlight it as much as possible. That the African Charter does contain that phrase. How exactly it got in, I'm sure it will be interesting to do some research. Why did it get it? But the 80s is a different period, you will remember. Okay, where I think, was it that African countries had broken relations with Israel? We are still during that period. So I think it will be interesting to do some research on that. But yes, I agree with what is pointed out by that comment. The Zionism is included in the African Charter.
Thank you so much, Issa. We've come to the end of our time, and it's such a shame because this is such a nuanced, interesting, and deep conversation that really we could have all evening. But I hope you've enjoyed Red Books Day. Red Books Day happens every year today, and it commemorates the publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1838 by Karl Marx. And we use this day to discuss socialist literature, red books, past and present. And so we're very happy that you're here with us. Thank you very much to the AULP, the African Union of Left Publishers, as well as CODESRIA, and of course to our amazing speaker, Issa Shivji, and the General Secretary of CODESRIA, Godwin Murunga. Godwin, if you have any other words to close, please let me know.
Definitely nothing to add. I think it's been a very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot. So thank you very much for giving us an opportunity to share Issa Shivji's book. We'll consider extracting the new introduction and sharing it as part of a CODESRIA bulletin online so that many other colleagues can have a look at it. Thank you.
Thank you. And everyone, please remember to get your copy of the book. It's available on the CODESRIA website. And please have a good evening further. Thank you very much for sharing it with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, God. Thank you very much, Efemia, for making this possible. Thank you.
Thank you.